that was intended to focus on outcomes, not process. So when you focus on outcomes, finding cures, delivering better therapies to patients, and you reverse engineer what do you need to do in order to accomplish that, you come up with a different way of doing business. One in which you don't necessarily pay attention to publishing only scholarly articles, you don't pay attention to promotion processes, which is not to say you should not pay attention to promotion processes, but rather that's not the primary goal of the Institute. And you certainly try to have novel combinations of people and ideas at different stages of their career, the purpose of which is to get and promote real innovation. Now, the challenging environment in which that takes place is that most of the work in research work in hospitals and in academic labs is financed through quite traditional ways, typically grants, most often from the National Institutes of Health. And that would be terrific if they were really seeking out the best people and the best ideas, and they didn't necessarily pay attention to how old you were or what institution you worked for. And it's been my experience, probably, I hope it hasn't been your experience, that it's not always operating in a way that comes up with funding the best and most interesting and impactful ideas. Often it's a way to fund incremental science. It's a way to support institutions because of the indirect cost reimbursement, but it's not necessarily the way to really change the paradigm and change the thinking. And so at the Stem Cell Institute, the basic idea was, could you supplement or find an alternative mechanism for funding that would be allocated in the way I describe it as intellectual venture capital. So what you would do is have people submit proposals. So it didn't have to be 25 pages, single-spaced, and what's the font you need to use? I mean, there's some font. And typically those proposals are for things to which you already know the answer, because if you don't know the answer, then they'll consider it too risky and will reject it. But this was intended to be very different. It was intended to say who could collaborate, who wouldn't typically collaborate. So linking people from hospitals, linking people from academic labs, linking people from chemistry or physics or electrical engineering with people who were traditional life sciences experts, and giving them a small amount of money and saying, go do something. And we'll track what you do. We'll actually ask how you're doing. This is an astonishing thing. And if you make progress, then it will make it possible to get more traditional sources of funding. So the basic idea was, could you create a structure that rewarded behaving differently, gave money to different kinds of people for different kinds of projects? And that was really the effort to go out and raise philanthropic dollars, and to then have a group of people who were eager to advance not just the science, but cures and better therapies, to have them allocate the capital in a pure meritocracy that was intended specifically not to be risk-averse. That is, back projects not simply because they're risky, but because they have very high potential payoff, even though they're risky. So if I look at the world in which I normally operate, which is the world of venture capital, there are a couple of things you should know, because I think it informs how people think about funding ventures and what the actual demographics are of venture capital. So over the past 15 years, it turns out that the failure rate of professional venture capitalists is almost 60%. And what I mean by that is they put money in lots of different companies. They believe all of them will be fantastic. They're sort of like your children. But after it's all said and done, 60% have done what Chuck Yeager used to call augured in. And all you have is a worthless stock certificate. Typically, you occasionally have coffee mugs and or T-shirts, but 60% have failed. Now, that would be a pretty bad business if you had a 60% failure rate, if there wasn't another side of the distribution. And the nice thing about venture investing is you typically can only lose 100% of your capital that you put in any single deal. I've tested that hypothesis and came close to losing more, but and you have unlimited upside on the other. So it turns out that where all the money is made is in those ventures that yield more than 10 times your money. And the best venture capital firms have a disproportionate number of the greater than 10x investments. They still have the same 60% failure rate, but they have lots of big winners. And in some cases, like a Facebook, 1,000 or 2,000 to 1 winners. And that's how those firms end up generating enough returns so that they satisfy not only the general partners, but also the limited partners. Well, it's important to think about the following. I would love to have a world in which I only got the winners. You know, Will Rogers said you should buy stocks when they're low and sell them when they go up. If they don't go up, don't buy them. So it would be great if we knew beforehand which were going to turn out to be winners. But we don't. And it turns out you don't get the greater than 10x outcomes unless you get the 60% losers. And that process must be fundamental, really, to science investing. by which I mean if you can't figure out a way to invest in projects that have very high potential payoffs, even if they have ultimately high mortality rates, then you are simply going to protect the status quo and not really make progress. The challenge in many cases is that if you're very, very early in the stage, very early in the science, then there's no clear path to a commercial outcome. And therefore, people who are interested in investing in those kinds of projects simply are not going to get money so early in the process. And that's why at the Stem Cell Institute, the idea was to raise philanthropic dollars and to allocate them accordingly. And at the Stem Cell Institute, importantly, not raise money in the way many hospitals do, which is what I call the grateful patient model, or my child has a specific disease, therefore I want you to cure this disease, but rather to support a new way of doing science. So something that was going to break down those boundaries, that would focus on the fundamental process of cell differentiation and what that might mean for drug discovery, what that might mean for regenerative medicine. So that's the basic idea. So venture capital, you don't get the good ones without the 60% failure. That's a fundamental. So the next thing you ought to keep in mind is that all ventures should be viewed as structured experiments. So let's say that instead of talking about life science, I go out here and I find a consumer-facing web company. So what they want to do is they want to create a prototype of their website. They want to stick it up there. They want to see whether or not the customers come and whether or not they can monetize. And conditional on that outcome, they go raise more money to scale up and hire more people and maybe build a more robust architecture behind it. And if that works, then they want to scale up one more time. So the thing I've come to believe is the following. There's the old saying that time is money, and I've turned it on its head, which is money is time. And so in structured experiments, you raise money to buy time to prove something. And if the proof is positive, then you get the right to raise more money to buy more time to prove something different. Now, in the situation with a web-facing consumer startup, it turns out it costs $5,000 to run the first experiment. Or it takes pizza. So if you can get a Harvard undergraduate to mock up a website, it's really not very expensive, and it typically doesn't take very long. You're in a completely different realm, in which both the amount of money required to get to the next proof point, the next inflection point, is high, the time is long, and the ultimate commercial payoff may be 15 years down the road. And so typically that's just a very hard sequence of investments to make because the likelihood of an interim failure is relatively high, and the cost of buying each unit of information is high, and a lot of it is outside of your control. That is, for example, what the FDA does, what the healthcare reimbursement system does. A lot of the payoff structure is really outside of your control. So the question is, where do you get the money to run these experiments? Now, it used to be, in the good old days, so if you go back to the history of Genentech and Hypertech and the like, that the amount of money required to start Genentech, just as an example, was measured in the millions of dollars. It was measured actually as under $10 million. So the point to produce a product was under $10 million. It was a relatively short period of time. And they raised money from venture capitalists. Venture capitalists are beginning to abandon the process of investing in life sciences because the time frames have gone out by at least another 5 years, and the amount of capital to prove those later points has doubled. And the uncertainty about the outcome has gone up. And so when you reverse engineer, well, where would I logically start to allocate my money in order to find the next great therapy or help rebuild heart muscle or accelerate the production of blood stem cells? The fact is, it's become harder and harder, and people are less willing to back the initial stages of that process. So you have to get money somewhere. The NIH, as I said, does perform an incredibly valuable function. It provides money to support those kinds of projects, but not all of the projects that you would like supported. So the first comment is philanthropy has turned out to be unbelievably important, and what all of us are going to need to do is to get more people to give more money without the expectation of financial return, but because they believe those investments will have a very high payoff because it's a leveraged investment in a new way of doing science. That then will advance the science further than would have been possible in the absence of those philanthropic dollars. It will also be leveraged by access to traditional sources like the NIH. And that typically was the point at which venture capitalists might come in. I'm sorry to tell you, that's not going to happen. There's several reasons. One is the median rate of return on venture capital in the past 12 years is 0. Now, there are days on which, like today, I believe 0 is a high return and attractive. It's not a good day in the stock market. 0, as you know, is the only number that actually compounds at the same rate as the interim return. people are not going to tie up their money